Booktube, it's Amy. I'm continuing on with my discussion of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. On Saturday, I did finish with The Guermantes Way, which is the third volume in this larger work. And overall, I don't think it is the best volume so far. I much preferred Within a Budding Grove. It seems like there's not a whole lot of action in this novel to begin with, but it seemed like there was more action, so to speak, within a Budding Grove. Much of The Guermantes Way involves our narrator essentially sitting in a room, eavesdropping on conversations and, recounting these conversations to us. He is at the point where he's no longer treated as a child. He's now treated as a young man, as an adult, and so he is able to make his way into society, and he's attending these parties and these at-home days. As you'll recall in my previous video, he had at the beginning of this volume developed a bit of an obsession to the point of being a stalker with Madame Guermantes. And he goes totally to the extent of seeking out his friend Saint Loup, who is the nephew of Madame Guermantes, to try to get a formal introduction to her, to try to get into her social circle. And we get the sense that he's partly in love with her, but he's also partly interested in her because of her position in society. And later on in this volume, almost in a blasé way, he mentions that, and I got entrance to Madame Guermantes' home, to her circle. She became interested in him. And it's odd because we're missing many pieces of the puzzle so far in the story, and perhaps we never get them, because I'm not sure why she would be interested in him. Somehow he is almost punching above his weight in society within this volume, but there's no explanation as to how or why, and we can't really attribute it all to Saint Loup, who is his friend and who, it could be supposed, helped get him, into this higher society. But the narrator seems to recount it as, I was with Saint Loup, and I went to this party here, and then Madame Guermantes invited me to her party, and at her party I was introduced to the Princess de Parme, and suddenly he is dining with the princess. And it seems to be this almost informal flow, and he tries to claim, that, it just sort of happened. That's the sense you get here. But I would think that something else would have to be going on in the background for him to suddenly catch the eye of the Princess de Parme. It is quite funny, though, when he is at Madame Guermantes and the Princess de Parme does appear, because she is the only one in the room that he doesn't know. And he is sort of being dragged across the floor by someone approaching her, thinking that he's going to get an introduction, but she is smiling and she greets him as if they've already met. And so he ends up saying something like, "It's so good to see you again," as he, rakes his mind to try to figure out who this woman is, wondering if perhaps she is, the mother of a childhood friend he hasn't seen in years, until he catches her name and realizes that it is this princess, and that the reason she pretended to know him was not because she believed that she knew him, but because in the conventions of society, it was not proper for anyone to be at this party that she didn't know. And so to save face for her cousin, Madame Guermantes, and to save face for herself, I guess, and to ensure that, everything was on the up and up, she just went ahead and pretended she knew our narrator, and the narrator went along with this too. And so you have this kind of comical scene where these two people who have never met are pretending to know each other for the benefit, I suppose, of everyone else in the room, because it's according to the societal norms. Which, I mean, it's just a really strange scene. There's another quite funny scene in here as well that has to do with social position. In some ways, I think The Guermantes Way deals a lot more with social position than the earlier volumes. Not to say that the earlier volumes don't, because of course you have Madame Swann struggling with social position, and a great deal of discussion of social position in Within a Budding Grove. But in this one, you have our narrator really starting to navigate these social landmines, so to speak. There's this scene where our narrator and his friend Saint-Loup go to this kind of upscale restaurant, and due to, some minor details, our narrator ends up going inside first, and Saint-Loup says, I'll be along in a minute or two, go ahead and get a table. And the head waiter, I guess, when he walks in, he doesn't recognize our narrator. Our narrator kind of fumbles with one of those revolving glass doors because he's not familiar with walking through a revolving door. And so he comes across looking perhaps lower class. He's not seen as someone who belongs in the smaller exclusive dining room, and so despite the fact that he takes his seat initially in this small exclusive dining room where Saint-Loup would normally eat, the manager, the waiter, whoever comes over and says, you're going to have to move. And they put him in the larger, less fancy dining room, and he ends up sitting by this door where there's a draft, and he complains about the draft. And the waiter or the manager, whoever, says, we can't close that door just for you. And so he's sitting there kind of unhappy, waiting for Saint-Loup. And Saint-Loup walks in and says, what are you doing sitting in here? Don't you want to sit in the fancier room, in the good room, in the smaller room? And of course, the staff and everything realizes, oh, this is a friend of Saint-Loup, because they know Saint-Loup there. And they kind of apologize, and he gets taken into the fancier room. And then when Saint-Loup is away chatting with someone, he gets mistaken as, first of all, as a baron. They call him a baron, and he says, oh, no, I'm not a baron. And so they're like, oh, I'm sorry, Duke. And he just lets it go because he thinks that, if he says, oh, I'm not a duke, they're going to, next thing you know, they're going to call him a prince or something. Because they got the impression, because of who he was with, that he would be, a member of this higher social class, when really he's not. And he is very much punching above his weight for some inexplicable reason. And it seems to be common in the society for, artists and people who are famous to be able to punch above their weight. But our narrator at this point is not famous. He has written nothing. He has essentially achieved nothing. But for whatever reason, all these people in society have decided that he is immensely interesting, and they must have him at their parties. So there are a few other things that do happen apart from our narrator sitting at parties in this volume. His grandmother dies, which is quite heart-wrenching for him. And there's a line that I really liked in relation to the death of his grandmother. She has a stroke, and he realizes that she is going to die soon. And he reflects here that she was not yet dead, but I was already alone. It's this sense that as people get old and get ill, they're not really the people they once were that we knew when they were young. And especially when someone's very ill, you can't rely on them in the same way that you could when they were healthy. And so he gets the sense, he feels as though he's already lost his grandmother, even though she's not yet dead. which I think was a very sad thought for him to be thinking about. And of course, we've got this absolute imbecile of a doctor who, shortly before her stroke, she had been in bed for several weeks, several months even. She was well aware that she was quite ill and would probably die in the near future, but the doctor comes along, this famous doctor, and says, there's nothing wrong with you. You'll be healthy as soon as you get in the right mind frame and believe you're healthy. And so in an effort to follow out the doctor's orders, he and his mother coax the grandmother, out on an outing, and it is on this outing that she overexerts herself and finally has this stroke that eventually leads to her death, which I think is quite sad. And we don't really get in this volume his full reaction to her death, but from what I've heard in the next volume, Sodom and Gomorrah, we do very much get, when he goes back to Baalbek, where he spent a lot of time with his grandmother in Within a Budding Grove, we finally get his emotional reaction to this. So his grandmother dies. We also have the reappearance of Albertine. Not a whole lot is happening with her in this volume yet, but we do understand that she is back in his life. She has come to see him in Paris, and she is not the little girl that she was the last time he saw her, and that she is willing to engage with him in an intimate way. So I'm guessing in the next volume we're going to see a lot more of her and their relationship. Let's see, what else did I have to say about this? So he picks up again in this volume the theme of reality not meeting expectations. In this sense, it's not, as in previous volumes, it's not the expectations of art, it's not the expectations of romance and love. Rather, what he is disillusioned with here is the expectations of society. He becomes disillusioned with Madame Guermantes as soon as he gets to know her. He had this image of her, but once he knows her, he realizes that she is really nothing special. And in this sense, we see once again that our narrator is quite callous. Let me flip to this page here on 689, where he is reflecting how much she likes him and how little he cares for her. He says, "She was incapable of understanding what I had looked for in her, the charm of her historic name and the tiny quantity of it that I found in her, a rustic survival from the Guermantes. Our relations were based on a misunderstanding which could not fail to become manifest as soon as my homage, instead of being addressed to the relatively superior woman she believed herself to be, was diverted to some other woman of equal mediocrity and exuding the same unconscious charm." So he's pretty much saying she's mediocre, and he's going to find any other woman just like her to be just as mediocre, because he is obsessed once again with an image. And he is realizing here that he has been let down in his vision of society and what he expected to find in these people. He's discovered that Madame Guermantes and the Princess de Parme, they are essentially people just like anyone else. They are nothing special. And so I will be interested to see how he moves in society from here on out. A lot of talk in this volume as well about the Dreyfus Affair, which I did have to look up. I guess this is a historical event. Goodness, I'm forgetting the year here. But late 1800s, 1890s, I believe. Don't quote me on that. This occurred. But essentially, there was a employee of the state. His name was Dreyfus, and he worked for the War Ministry, and he was accused of selling military secrets to Germany. Now, he was Jewish, and he was essentially framed for this. Evidence was manufactured, and even after they discovered who really did it, the state continued to stick by their prosecution of him, and so society was very much divided. So that's just a little tidbit of what's happening in this volume here. I will return soon with my initial thoughts on the next volume, Sodom and Gomorrah.